We're wrapping up our 5th anniversary look at Double Fine Adventure today the only way we know how, with a review. We're going to compare how accurate the final game is next to what was initially pitched, and seeing if Double Fine accomplished everything they set out to do. At first glance, it appears the Kickstarter page for Double Fine Adventure is threadbare, a total disaster of a Kickstarter compared to today's standards. There's no information about what the game will be, other than it'll be an adventure game. Project lead Tim Schafer spends most of the pitch video seemingly contemplating himself and complaining about how bad big publishers are, and there's not even a title for the game. But right up front, Double Fine is laying out exactly what it wants to achieve. It wouldn't be any more obvious if the goals were listed in bullet point form and projected onto the moon. These objectives are threefold, all told by Schafer himself. 1. To show people how video games are made through a documentary series. 2. To make an old-school point-and-click adventure game that doesn't feel like an old-school point-and-click adventure game. And the third one we've already touched on, to afford Double Fine an opportunity to break from the traditional publisher-financed model of game development, and to give other developers the same chance. All of this you can find in the pitch video. But that theme carries over to the Kickstarter page itself, and various updates from the first year or so. In the opening paragraph of the original Kickstarter campaign, Double Fine makes their biggest intention clear. The world of video game design is a mysterious one. What really happens behind the closed doors of a development studio is often unknown, unappreciated, or misunderstood. And the bigger the studio, the more tightly shut its doors tend to be. With this project, we're taking that door off its hinges and inviting you into the world of Double Fine Productions. Just a little bit further down the page, you can see Double Fine talking about their second point, the publishers. They start by talking about how games cost a lot of money to make, more than you'd expect, before taking a direct shot at the video game publishing industry at large. To finance the production, promotion, and distribution of these massive undertakings, companies like Double Fine have to rely on external sources like publishers, investment funds, or loans. And while they fulfill an important role in the process, their involvement also comes with significant strings attached that can pull the game in the wrong directions, or even cancel its production altogether. Thankfully, viable alternatives have emerged and gained momentum in recent years. Crowdsourced fundraising sites like Kickstarter have been an incredible boon to the independent development community. They democratize the process by allowing consumers to support the games they want to see developed and give the developers the freedom to experiment, take risks, and design without anyone compromising their vision. Believe it or not, these two sections represent the bulk of their campaign. We're 2/3 of the way through the Kickstarter page, and Double Fine hasn't yet said a word about what the game is they intend to produce. And if you think that's going to change in the final third, then I have bad news for you. Over a 6 to 8 month period, a small team under Tim Schafer's supervision will develop Double Fine's next game, a classic point-and-click adventure. Where it goes from there will unfold in real time for all backers to see. In terms of information about what exactly it is you're backing, that's all you've got. The rest of the page talks about 2Play Productions and their role with the documentary, as well as some reward information, and that's that. Not a word is uttered about what the actual game Double Fine is making will be like. There is that mention of adventure games earlier, but no official declaration of the style of game, the gameplay, the art style, the story, or anything outside of that on the page itself. All of the pertinent information on the game is contained within the pitch video, and even there, there's not much outside of classic point-and-click adventure game by Tim Schafer. Now, I've already mentioned in both our previous videos that none of this is necessarily a problem. Frankly, there's not a ton you need to know about the game other than classic point-and-click adventure game by Tim Schafer, because this campaign was primarily directed at those fans. And besides, I don't think the game was ever the main focus of this whole thing anyway, at least not at the beginning. The $400,000 is a tiny fraction compared to what Double Fine was used to working with, and from what Tim Schafer himself was saying, they were looking to make a game roughly on par with some of the small Flash games that they host on their website. No, instead, I think the first and third points were the real driving force behind the campaign in its early days, to show people how video games were made, and to provide a viable alternative funding method to game developers. That's not to say they didn't care about the game portion of it though. Obviously they wanted to make a great game. But it's only when the campaign blew up to huge, mega super duper status that the game itself suddenly became elevated to being just as important as those other 2 points. Suddenly, the team had a lot more money to work with, and Tim realized he could make a full-on proper game instead of a small online Flash equivalent. Because of that, there's not a whole lot to go on in terms of comparing how accurate the Kickstarter pitch was to the final game, which of course became Broken Age. Instead, we're going to have to look at some of the updates in the aftermath of the game's 2 releases and see what many fans thought themselves, trying our best to isolate objective thoughts on the game from all the outside anger surrounding the campaign and the game being split in 2 parts. The first half, Act 1 as Double Fine was calling it, released to the public on January 28, 2014, just under 2 years after the Kickstarter began. The general consensus was that the game was good, great even, with an amazingly wonderful art style, engaging writing, and 2 playable protagonists. Schafer had mentioned that he wanted to advance the genre and not just make an old-school point-and-click. If we compare Broken Age to, say, Ron Gilbert's, that's Tim's old boss by the way, own Kickstarter game, Thimbleweed Park, it's obvious Double Fine managed to pull it off. Whereas Thimbleweed Park is clearly trying to emulate 90s point-and-clicks in both its art style and gameplay, i.e. the massive list of verbs to choose from at the bottom of the screen, Broken Age feels much more modern and different. The aforementioned art style would never have been possible in the 90s, with every background and character being hand-painted by artist Nathan Stapley. The archaic list of verbs, no offense Thimbleweed Park, is replaced by a simple system of clicking on an object and choosing to examine, use, or pick up, similar to Tim's last adventure game, Grim Fandango. The most noticeable difference, however, was the difficulty. Any fan of adventure games can tell you that the genre is built on 2 things: good writing and impossibly mind-bending puzzles. The best ones feature logic puzzles that require you to gather a bunch of objects and think about how they all fit together, whereas the terrible ones are more a game of think what random, stupid thing the developer was thinking and try and emulate it. Broken Age didn't fit into either camp, as the game was dramatically easier than anything Tim Schafer had ever worked on, possibly even any other adventure game back then outside of maybe those Freddy Fish and Putt-Putt games. Naturally, this left a lot of fans in the genre disappointed, but it also disappointed most regular gamers as well, because there was nothing really in the game to fill the place of that challenge. The writing was great as you'd expect, but that was only half the game. One way the game changed from how it was originally planned was how the 2 protagonists interacted. They didn't. At all. In one of the documentary episodes, Tim talked about how he hoped some of the puzzles would require you to switch back and forth between the 2, Shay and Vela, to solve problems. However, that never happens. In fact, since the game never forces you to switch to the other protagonist, it's possible, and this happened to me, that you'll finish one protagonist's route without yet ever playing the other, and have that other character's story ruined for you by the ending of the character you did play as. Still, despite these few hiccups, the game's writing and art style alone was more than enough to carry the game to great reviews, and even the game's many haters started quieting down, as did Double Fine themselves. Both the number of Kickstarter updates they published, as well as the number of documentary episodes, dramatically decreased after the first half was released. After all of that, Act 2 was released after multiple delays on April 28, 2015, 14 months after Act 1, and over 3 years after the Kickstarter. The reception to Act 2 was much more lukewarm compared to Act 1, for several reasons. Everything everyone loved about the first was more or less gone. The lovely art style remained, as the second half recycled every background and character from the first, introducing nothing new visually. The story collapsed thanks to a random plot twist at the start of the second act, with one of the protagonists morphing from a tragic, likable but flawed hero to just kind of an annoying asshole, and a complete non-ending that makes the end of The Sopranos look definitive in comparison. The puzzles were changed as well, and we see in the documentary series Tim directly addressing the puzzles being too easy. How did he get around this? By making them frustratingly difficult and completely illogical, of course, including a bug in one of them that made it impossible to solve until it was patched. With Act 2, it was clear that Double Fine simply ran out of time and money. The fact that the game was an afterthought to proving the publishing industry wrong and presenting a documentary became clear, and while the overall game was enough to stave off Double Fine's worst critics and haters, it wasn't enough to either obliterate or change game publishers, and only showed that most gamers really aren't ready to see the nitty-gritty of how games are made. Broken Age is the cliched two-sided coin. One half is polished and gleaming with promise. It's got a beautiful art style unlike any we've seen in games before, with an engaging cast of characters and a story that sinks its teeth into you. The other half is covered in grime, corroded with bad plot twists, reused environments, a terrible ending, and nonsense puzzles that would leave even MC Escher befuddled. Double Fine has partially given up on the dream of being able to ditch publishers, working with the likes of Sega, Adult Swim, and Sony since the Kickstarter, but they do act with more autonomy than before, and more freedom within those contracts. Most seem to have forgotten about Broken Age the game by now, instead remembering the Kickstarter and everything that came with it. Perhaps that's Broken Age's legacy, not as a video game, but an experiment. As Tim says in the documentary, that's not how he wants it to be remembered, but time has a habit of ignoring the wants and desires of us all, and for better for worse, Broken Age will always be regarded as the game that made crowdfunding viable for gaming, and while it may be forgotten as a game, that's a far more important legacy.